Over in Havana, 1991, you've got this bloke, Carlos, standing in a government food queue on a Tuesday morning. He's an accountant, been doing the same job for 11 years too. He's got a little flat, a missus, 2 kids, and a wage that was, up until recently, doing the trick. He's been stuck in this queue since before the crack of dawn. This queue stretches for 2 blocks behind him and hasn't budged an inch in an hour. The shelves he'll eventually get to are pretty much bare, not just a bit empty, but proper empty. What's hit Carlos isn't just a local drama. It's not a stuff-up by management, a bad harvest, or a transport strike. Nah, the Soviet Union's gone and cut off the whole shebang. The subsidies, the oil deliveries, the trade deals, the fertilizer, the lot. In just a few months flat, Cuba's lost 80% of its imports. The oil that kept the tractors, the fridge trucks, and the food processing plants humming? Gone burger, mate. That fertilizer that helped grow the sugar, tobacco, and rice? That's gone too. The whole food system, which was built over 30 years on Soviet imports, gear, and credit, has just packed it in. The average Cuban bloke is now only scoffing down about 1,860 calories a day, a fair drop from 2,900 just 2 years back, nearly a 40% fall. Meanwhile, somewhere in Havana, a doctor called Rosaralis Santia Stephen, over at the Neurology and Neurosurgery Institute, has just cottoned on to an epidemic, optic neuropathy. Basically, heaps of people going blind from not enough tucker. This disease is spreading like wildfire through western Cuba, especially in the provinces where they do all the sugarcane. 50,000 cases in 2 years, with 3,000 new ones a week at its peak in April '93, particularly in Pinar del Rio province. The numbers are hitting over 13 cases for every 100,000 people. Folks are going blind because they're not getting enough tucker in a country that, just 30 years prior, was one of the top farming spots in the Caribbean. No worries. Carlos hasn't got any land. He's never grown a thing. And neither has anyone he knows well. The Cuba he grew up in was a modern industrial setup. You didn't grow your own tucker, you just bought it at the bodega or got it on the libreta. That ration book. That was the go. How things worked back then. He's got no clue what he's about to do, and his government's just as stumped. What happens next in Cuba is one of the most remarkable and least understood yarns in modern financial history, mate. It's not a yarn about government policy, even though the government eventually tried to take the credit for it. And it's certainly not about international aid, because bugger all of that actually showed up. Nah, it's a story about what everyday blokes do when the official tucker system goes belly up, what they grab, what they cobble together with their own hands. To get your head around what Carlos is up against, you gotta understand a decision made in a tiny lab in southwestern Germany 82 years before. Karlsruhe, July 3rd, 1909. There's this chemist bloke, Fritz Haber, standing in front of some gear that's 75 centimeters tall. It was a fairly humble bit of kit for an experiment that had changed the world, mind you. Haber, born in Breslau in 1868, was methodical and relentless, a bit of a tortured soul on the quiet. He'd been slogging away at this problem for yonks. His assistant, a young engineer mate named Robert La Rosigno, watches the apparatus churn out, over the course of a morning, roughly 1 small cup of ammonia. Just 1 cup, eh? Haber had cracked a problem that had stumped scientists for 50 years. Nitrogen makes up 78% of the air we breathe, but atmospheric nitrogen is inert, locked up tight in a form plants can't use. Since day dot, agriculture had relied on natural nitrogen cycles, animal manure, composted plant waste, and legumes that fixed nitrogen through their roots by hosting bacteria in their root nodules. These methods worked a treat. They'd fed civilizations for 10,000 years, no worries. But they were a bit slow. They put a cap on how much you could grow, and farmers had to know their dirt inside out, its biology, its chemistry, its specific deficiencies. What Haber found was a way to rip nitrogen right out of the air and force it, under heaps of pressure and heat, into ammonia. Synthetic fertilizer. Pure nitrogen you could get at an industrial scale, on tap whenever you needed it. A chemical engineer bloke at BASF, Karl Bosch, then ramped up the process. By 1913, the Opal plant was churning out 20 tons of synthetic nitrogen every single day. Righto, so by 1914, Bosch's mate Alwin Mitasch, after chucking a look at over 6,000 different materials, stumbled upon this iron-based catalyst that made the whole thing heaps cheaper. And get this, it's pretty much the exact same catalyst they're still using today in every single synthetic fertilizer plant on the planet. Haber snagged a Nobel Prize for chemistry back in 1918, and Bosch got his in '31. What those two blokes cooked up completely transformed agriculture, mate, in a way the world had never, ever witnessed. Crop yields, which had been pretty stagnant for yonks, suddenly shot up, doubling, then tripling. Back in 1900, there were only 1.6 billion people on Earth. Now we're looking at over 8 billion. This food boffin, Václav Smil, in his Ripper study, Enriching the Earth, worked out that roughly half of all the people kicking around today owe their very existence to that Haber-Bosch synthesis. Yeah, half of us, about 4 billion people, give or take. Every single nitrogen atom in those 4 billion bodies has, at some stage, done a trip through an industrial plant via the food chain. Norman Borlaug, the legend whose semi-dwarf wheat varieties kicked off the Green Revolution and scored him a Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, didn't mince his words. He told the prize committee, "Chemical fertilizer, mate, that's the fuel that really got the Green Revolution humming along." He was chuffed about it, but it also pretty much summed up how reliant we'd become. See, what went down in the decades after Haber and Bosch wasn't just a boost in Tucker production, it was a bit of an erasure. A quiet, slow, almost invisible vanishing act of something that had taken 10,000 years to build up. Farmers who'd been doing crop rotations for generations just chucked them in within a decade of synthetic fertilizers rocking up. Why bother rotating your crops to get nitrogen naturally when you could just grab a bag of the stuff? And why even worry about your soil's biology when these chemicals made it all a bit pointless? Why teach your kids how to read a paddock when they could just spray the whole lot? By the 1960s, the Yanks were chucking on 83 pounds of synthetic nitrogen per acre each year. Between 1960 and 1990, global nitrogen fertilizer use went up a whopping 700%. Just a few crops like corn, soybeans, wheat, and rice started to take over farmland worldwide because they loved the industrial stuff and could be grown on a massive scale by fewer and fewer people. Back in 41% of the American workforce were farmers. By 2000, that was down to a measly 2%. All that know-how that built our food system just buggered off the land in one generation. And no one even blinked, because the supermarket shelves were chockers. Just 10 crops now provide a massive 83% of all the food calories harvested on Earth. And get this, over 186 million acres of American cropping land are planted with patented seed varieties that you're not allowed to legally keep and replant. Every single year, you've got to buy those seeds again. And every year, that reliance just gets deeper. The whole shebang runs on synthetic nitrogen, which needs natural gas, and that gas gets shipped through a few maritime choke points, any one of which could just shut down on any given day. That's the world Carlos copped in 1991, an industrial food system that was incredibly productive, but also incredibly fragile. It was all good in normal times, but an absolute disaster when the supplies dried up. The official yarn about Cuba's special period is all about government handling, rationing, belt tightening, international sympathy, and folks just getting by. But the real dinkum story, mate, is what went down in all those empty blocks. See, while the government was handing out ration books and calling for international mateship, something completely different was brewing at street level all over Havana. Cubans, the accountants, the teachers, the factory workers, even the old soldiers, they all started digging in. They dug up vacant lots in the moats of those old colonial forts, in school courtyards, on rooftops, pretty much any bit of unused dirt they could get their hands on. The system they knocked together has a name: organoponicos. These were raised garden beds, chock-a-block with organic matter, compost, earthworms, whatever biological bits and bobs they could find. They planted them close together and looked after them as co-ops, not just individual blokes. No synthetic fertilizer, because there wasn't any to be had, and no pesticides for the same reason. It was pure biological growing, not because they chose it, but because they absolutely had to. This agroecologist bloke, Miguel Altieri, from the University of California, Berkeley, wrote down what he saw when he popped over to Havana in the mid-90s. By 1996, only 5 years after everything went pear-shaped, the city's urban farms were already churning out Tucker on a decent scale. By 2001, the veggie yields had shot up an incredible 17 times from their starting point. Altieri's take on it was that these urban farms were now supplying 70% or even more of all the fresh vegetables eaten in Havana. 70% of it came from the city, all without any synthetic fertilizer or fossil fuel machinery. A couple of top blokes who really led the charge in this movement were Nelson Campagnoni from the Inifat Research Institute, who was in charge of the National Urban Agriculture Program, and Fernando Funes Sr. over at the Pasture and Forage Institute, who pretty much organized Cuba's whole organic agriculture scene. Peter Rossett, the big boss at Food First, had a squiz at this change from the outside. He reckoned it was the biggest crack at switching from regular farming to alternative, semi-organic agriculture in the history of the world. Fair dinkum. The government finally got their act together and organized it all in '94. Havana opened its Department of Urban Agriculture, and farmers' markets popped up for the first time in 40 years, too. The government didn't actually kick it off, no worries. Carlos and his neighbors were the ones who got it going. The locals built this co-op in the Vivero Alamar neighborhood, a fair bit of land, 10.5 hectares in eastern Havana, with about 150 farmers working on what used to be just a construction site. They built it because they just needed to eat, plain and simple. And that's the bit every story about Cuba's special period seems to gloss over. There's this bloke, Nelson, in Havana's El Cerro neighborhood, who keeps a patch on his 68-square-meter rooftop. Up on that rooftop, he's got 40 guinea pigs, 6 chooks, a couple of turkeys, and more than 100 rabbits. He sells them off to the local markets and restaurants. Kerry Klaus has documented his setup in the Princeton Architectural Press study, Farming Cuba. It's not unusual at all, mate. It's just one of thousands of similar operations all over the shop in the city, on rooftops, in courtyards, and even on old rubble lots they've cleaned up. One bloke, 68 square meters, 100 rabbits. That's not some government program, is it? That's just someone having a crack at solving a problem with whatever they've got. Cuba's whole system went belly up pretty quick and completely. You couldn't miss it. But a similar yarn had been quietly ticking along for 70 years on the edges of every Soviet city. The dacha. That word comes from a Russian verb meaning to give. Peter the Great formalized the practice of chucking in suburban land back in the early 18th century. By the Soviet era, the dacha had turned into a bit of a pickle for the state. They both feared it and needed it. It was a private food system running right alongside the official collectivized one. The figures are pretty stark, too. Private plots, dachas, and home veggie patches only took up about 3% of Soviet agricultural land. Just 3%, mind you. But they churned out roughly 25 to 30% of the Soviet Union's total food. Historian Hedge Smith had a gander at the specific breakdown from the 1973 Soviet Economic Yearbook, when he was the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times. These private plots were knocking out 62% of all Soviet spuds, 32% of all fruit and veggies, 47% of all chook eggs, and 34% of all meat and milk. The Soviet state had collectivized farming, but it cost them millions of lives. They'd starved the Ukrainian countryside into submission back in the 1930s just to make them comply. On principle, they were dead against private ownership of productive land, fair dinkum. But they still allowed, and eventually even encouraged, a shadow food system, keeping it on the down low. Why? Because without it, the official system couldn't feed the country. The whole story of Soviet policy on the dacha is basically the state having a blue with itself over something it just couldn't get rid of. Under Stalin, private plots were kept on a tight leash, but they hung on because they had no choice, really. Under Khrushchev, who tried to rein him in because he saw him as a bit of an embarrassment, those restrictions led to food shortages so bad it sped up his political ousting in 1964, giving him the boot, basically. Under Brezhnev, the government did a U-turn in the 1970s. They started chucking out standard 600-square-meter plots, that's about 1/7 of an acre, to factory workers in the cities. Not because they were being generous, no worries, but as an acknowledgement that the official Tucker system couldn't be trusted to go it alone. 600 square meters, smaller than 2 regular American tennis courts, and on those plots, Soviet families grew spuds, cabbages, carrots, and berries. They pickled and preserved everything, stashing it away in root cellars, and they swapped any extra stuff with their neighbors. They built a whole parallel food economy that the state couldn't get a full handle on, couldn't tax properly, and couldn't get rid of without causing the very food shortages it was trying to avoid. No worries. When the Soviet Union went belly up in December of '91, this shadow system actually proved tougher than the official one. A UN mob study reckoned that by '91, a fair dinkum 65% of Moscow families were having a crack at growing their own tucker in the city. And get this, the amount of grub families grew themselves, compared to the whole country's stash, shot up from 32% in '90 to over 50% by 2000. Western governments, seeing the Soviet Union go belly up, got stuck into organizing emergency food aid. Turns out, most of that wasn't really needed. Those dachas just soaked up all the drama. There was this old battler, Mrs. Kolbetskaya, who the Christian Science Monitor wrote about back in '09. She'd knocked up her dacha using bits of salvaged timber, about 160 clicks east of Moscow. She just grew whatever that soggy soil would cough up. Her extra produce kept her daughter's family fed through the cold winters when the official economy was pretty much cactus. She wasn't some doomsday prepper mate. She wasn't getting ready for everything to go pear-shaped. She just kept on doing what her family had always done, because it just made good sense, eh? That's the dacha for you. 70 years of just quietly getting on with it, using 3% of the land to churn out 25 to 30% of the tucker. It was the biggest financial safety net in modern history, but no one ever called it that. Over in Britain, on September 12, 1939, a journo called Michael Foot, who later became the boss of the British Labour Party, chucked an article into the London Evening Standard. The headline? Just 2 words. Dig for victory. 9 days after that, the Minister for Agriculture, Sir Reginald Dorman Smith, made it fair dinkum official on the BBC radio. He kept it pretty straight, saying, "The main idea should be dig for victory, for anyone with a garden, and every bloke in Sheila who's fit enough to dig up an allotment in their spare time." Back in '39, Britain was importing 60% of its tucker. And those shipping routes across the Atlantic were already looking a bit dodgy even before the first shot was fired. The numbers were dead set grim. If the supply lines went belly up, the country only had weeks of grub, not months. The government cottoned on to the seriousness straight away. What they didn't quite get at first, though, was that they weren't starting something new. They were just firing up something that was already there. Britain had this long-standing tradition of allotments, going back yonks. During the First World War, the number of allotments had shot up from 450,000. They'd hit 1.5 million during a similar push in the Depression, with the Society of Friends even chipping in for seeds and tools for the out-of-work miners in Wales. That know-how hadn't just vanished between the wars. It had shrunk a bit, pulled back. But the really keen and stubborn folks kept it going. It was just sitting there, waiting for its moment. By '43, the official numbers from the Ministry of Agriculture showed 1.4 million allotments all over Britain. Some historians, chucking in all the unofficial and makeshift plots, reckon the total was closer to 1.75 million. And on top of that, about 5 million private gardens were also churning out tucker right next to the proper allotments. The total amount of land being farmed in Britain went from 12 million acres when the war kicked off to 18 million by the time it finished. They pretty much turned everything into a veggie patch. Even the moat at the Tower of London got a look in. Yeoman warders called Burrows, Stevens, and Box were the ones doing the hard yakka. The lawns at Kensington Gardens, the areas around the Albert Memorial, and even Buckingham Palace's rose beds were all sacrificed so they could grow onions. While the royal family publicly got on board, a bomb crater in the Westminster Cathedral grounds was cleared of all the rubbish and then planted up. The grassy bits along London's parks, the school playing fields that were shut due to evacuations, and the front yards of factories all got put to good use. This bloke, C.H. Middleton, a BBC radio presenter born in 1886 and just known as Mr. Middleton, ended up being Britain's first famous gardener. His show, In Your Garden, pulled in 3.5 million listeners by 1940. By '42, a massive 70% of British households with a radio were tuning in. They were listening every week to hear a fella in his 50s give them the lowdown on how to grow their own tucker. A bunch of young fellas in Bethnal Green, Frankie, Ronnie, Joey, George, and Ken, used rubbish bin lids with holes punched in them to sift out glass and shrapnel from a bombed-out city block. They then turned it into a victory garden. More than 300 adults and kids joined them in the Bethnal Green Bomb Sites Producers Association, all working on the same idea across heaps of different blocks. Queen Elizabeth even popped in for a visit on June 17, 1943. The London Midland Scottish Railway mate, they looked after a whopping 22,000 allotments right along their tracks. Having one of those little veggie patches out the back became as common as your front door, fair dinkum. By '43 and '44, a quarter of all the eggs scoffed in Britain came from chooks in people's backyards, looked after by more than 250,000 members of the Domestic Poultry Keepers Council. And get this. By the time the war wrapped up, Britain's home gardens and allotments had churned out over 1 million tons of veggie. Homegrown calorie production shot up from 33% when the war kicked off to 44% by the time it finished. This country, which usually imported 60% of its tucker, even with the blockade, managed to grow nearly half of what they ate right there on their own patch. Right, and here's the bit the history books hardly ever mention, the real story. The government, yeah, they kicked off that Dig for Victory campaign. The government, they supplied all the posters, the radio broadcasts, and the rules and regs. Lord Woolton, the food minister, He rationed out what was available and made sure it went around for everyone. Yeah, those things were important, no worries. But what the government didn't actually do was create the know-how that made any of it possible in the first place. That know-how, mate, it was already there way before the campaign even started. It was in those allotment associations that had been around for yonks. It was in all the households that had never stopped having chooks. And it was in every family that had kept up the habit of growing a bit of tucker through those tough times during the Depression. The veggie patch. It came before the policy, fair enough. But before we make the argument for the garden, we gotta hear the argument against it. 'Cause there's a version of this yarn where the garden goes pear-shaped, where it's too late, where the dependency has just got too entrenched. Ireland, 1845. The disease rocked up in August, first spotted at the National Botanic Gardens in Glasnevin, Dublin. This water mold, Phytophthora infestans, had come all the way from the Toluca Valley in central Mexico, hopped across the Atlantic to Belgium, and then landed in Ireland from the continent by the end of that year. A third to the half of the spud crop right across Ireland had croaked it. Then in 1846, the blight just wiped out more than 90%. In 1847, known as Black 47, at least 400,000 Irish folk kicked the bucket. Over the whole famine period, about 1 million people died from starvation and sickness. Another 1 to 2 million packed up and left the country. Ireland's population dropped from 8.2 million in 1841 to 6.5 million a decade later, and it just kept on dropping. Ireland still hasn't got back to its pre-famine population, even 180 years down the track. The question historians have been arguing about since then isn't what caused the blight, nah. The real question is why Ireland went belly up when other European countries copying the same blight didn't. Belgium copped the blight, France copped it, the Netherlands too. In Germany, none of them came anywhere near a total disaster. When the blight hit, they had a tough time. But they bounced back. What made the difference was monoculture, see? By the 1840s, about a third of Ireland's 8 million folk relied solely on just one crop, and even just one type of that crop. Farmers were planting the Irish lumper, first recorded in an 1808 farming survey of County Clare. Brought over from Scotland, it produced way more than the better types, up to 30% more, almost everywhere across western and central Ireland. On that poor, wet, marginal soil, it was perfect for the small, chopped-up plots that Irish tenant farmers were farming after generations of land enclosure and those harsh penal law restrictions. The lumper was also an exact copy, a clone. Every single lumper plant in Ireland had the exact same DNA, so they all copped the same disease when Phytophthora infestans rocked up. There was no plan B, no other type, no other crop, no way to spread the risk. The Irish country folk out west had swapped being tough for getting more spuds, over decades of small, sensible choices made one farm at a time. Every farmer who chucked in another acre of lumpers instead of keeping a mixed veggie patch made a fair dinkum reasonable economic choice at the time. When you chucked all those sensible choices together across the population, mate, it ended up creating a system with absolutely no wiggle room. Before the spud came along, Ireland actually had a much more diverse tucker supply. Oats, barley, rye, and dairy. This move to just growing spuds, mate, it happened over decades. It was all about trying to survive on less and less land, thanks to this landlord setup that was always pinching the best crops to flog overseas. By the time that blight rocked up, mate, folks in the western parts had pretty much forgotten how to grow anything else. And fair dinkum, that landlord system just made the whole schmozzle way worse, and we've got the records to prove it. While folks were starving their guts out, mate, the tucker just kept on moving. In 47, nearly 4,000 ships were carting food straight out of Irish ports to Britain. We're talking beef, pork, butter, grain, all flogged off under military guard, right past people literally dying in the ditches by the roads. Unbelievable, eh? Charles Trevelyan, the bloke from the British Treasury who was in charge of sorting out the famine, he knocked back every single request to shut the ports. Perfect free trade is the only way to go, he reckoned. He actually went and called the famine, get this, an act of divine providence, like God was just fixing up the Irish character. And fair dinkum, the crown went and knighted him in 48 for how he managed the whole thing. Over in the west of Ireland, Connaught, they lost a massive 28% of their population. But East Ulster, with all its linen industry, flax for cash, easy port access, and a bit of economic variety, well, they only lost a tiny fraction of that, mate. Same island, same rotten blight. But the results, mate, they just split right down the middle based on whether they had a bit of economic and farming variety or not. The big takeaway isn't that a veggie patch will always save your bacon. It's more that by the time a crisis hits, it might be too late to even get one going. Back in 1845, Ireland had absolutely no fallback plan, see? Because that safety net had been pulled apart bit by bit, one sensible-sounding farm decision after another, until they were completely buggered. Righto, back in 1917 in America, there was this bloke, Charles Lathrop Pack. His mates at the time reckoned he was one of the 5 richest Yanks around. Anyway, he got the National War Garden Commission up and running in Washington that March. This was only a few weeks before the states officially jumped into the First World War, mind you. By 1918, mate, over 5 million garden patches were churning out a fair dinkum estimated 1.5 million quarts of tinned fruit and veggies. And get this, the Bureau of Education even got the school kids organized as soldiers of the soil. Pack wrote a whole book about the whole shebang, called The War Garden Victorious. Then, 24 years down the track, the next big push was even bigger, mate. Just a week after Pearl Harbor, Secretary of Agriculture Claude Wickard got a national garden conference together. The target they set was pretty ambitious, but fair dinkum. The actual result blew it out of the water by heaps. By 43, mate, there were roughly 20 million victory gardens popping up all over the states. City blocks, rooftops, suburban backyards, factory grounds, schools, hospitals, even the lawns of government buildings. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's own books spell it out clear as day. Home gardens supplied about 40% of America's veggie supply in 1944. That's not 40% of all Tucker, mind you, but 40% of all the veggies coming from 20 million private gardens. And these were from folks who weren't even growing food a few years before, but picked it up in just 1 or 2 growing seasons. How good is that? Eleanor Roosevelt. She went and planted a garden at the White House in 43, even though the Department of Agriculture was whinging that it had hurt the food industry. She grew beans, carrots, tomatoes, and some cabbage, which was partly looked after by Diana Hopkins, a 10-year-old, who was the daughter of presidential advisor Harry Hopkins. Good on her, I reckon. A public opinion poll from 43 found that a fair chunk, 54% of those victory gardeners, were doing it for the money, mate. Only 20% even bothered to mention patriotism. The government tried to spin it as a big sacrifice, but the folks actually doing it, they just saw it as a way to save a few quid. Then bugger me, the war wrapped up. Within just a few years, not decades, mind you, almost all of it just vanished into thin air. The National Park Service has actually got it all documented, what went down. Folks just wanted to get away from all that wartime hardship, mate. They were keen for the good times and easy living that the post-war economy was promising. That American dream that popped up in the 50s, it was all about a big green lawn, not a veggie patch, eh? A perfectly green, sprayed up, but pretty useless lawn, eh? Only a couple of those old victory gardens have been going strong, non-stop, since the big war. Over in Boston, the Fenway Victory Gardens, set up in 42, they've got 500 patches. And the Dowling one in Minneapolis from 43, that's got 190 plots. Just 2 out of 20 million, that's all. The mob who grew their own Tucker, who knocked up 20 million gardens and churned out 40% of the veggies, they barely passed any of that know-how onto their kids. After just one generation of post-war good times, a skill that had kept civilization ticking for 10,000 years turned into a bit of a pastime for the quirky and the farming types. And then, fair dinkum, just another thing on social media. These days, the average American farmer is 58. Back in 41, 41% of the workers were on the land. Now, it's only 2%. The folks who actually remember how to grow a heap of Tucker are pretty much all gone these days. Righto, 2026. Fertilizer prices over in the States shot up more than 40% in just 1 month, after the Strait of Hormuz basically shut down. A third of the world's fertilizer supply goes through that narrow bit of water. Unlike oil, there's no strategic stash of fertilizer, no national pile, no backup at all. If the supply gets cut off during spring planting, farmers can't just hang about for a later delivery and still expect the same yield. The corn plant soaks up most of its nitrogen in those first few weeks of growing. Chuck it on late, and the harvest drops like a stone. Miss that chance altogether, and you've lost it for the whole year. The USDA reckoned corn prices for 2026 would be under the average national break-even point for farmers. Illinois corn growers were staring down the barrel of $229 an acre just for fertilizer. Experts figured global Tucker prices might jump 12 to 18% above what they were before the crisis by year's end. Maybe even more in the first half of next year. Even if the stoush wrapped up tomorrow, the fertilizer that didn't get put down in March and April of 2026 can't be undone. The crop's already decided, mate. You can't turn back the clock. This is the lumper potato, mate. just one global input. A few sticky spots, no strategic stashes, and no one remembers how we used to do it. Every farm that swapped from rotating crops to using synthetic nitrogen made a fair dinkum smart financial call. But when you add all those choices up over a generation of farming, they've built a food system with hardly any wiggle room for safety. When it goes belly up, it all goes belly up at the same time, everywhere. And that's when it hits home, right then and there. The whole off-grid and homesteading caper for most of the last 30 years, it was just seen as a bit of a cultural oddity, a lifestyle choice for a certain type of American. Country folk, a bit wary of the big institutions, keen on doing their own thing. As a bit of an identity, YouTube channels, Insta accounts, and content creators whipping up cheese and rearing old-school chooks, they grab an audience who admire it from afar but wouldn't ever give it a go themselves. But what history actually tells us is a different story. The folks history called a bit out there, on the outer, or too careful, like the Russian Nan with her dacha patch, the Cuban bloke on a rooftop, or the British allotment holder who just kept on gardening through the hard times. They weren't weirdos at all. They were the ones who had Tucker when everyone else was queuing up. The USDA's 2022 farming census has a bit of info that barely got a mention. The number of American farmers under 44 years old went up by 7% compared to 2017. The biggest leap was with the farmers under 25. More than 1 million new farmers, blokes and Sheilas with 10 years or less under their belt, now make up 30% of all American growers. Something's definitely on the move. G'day, turns out folks are moving to the bush too. Rural America's actually seen its population go up every year since 2020, which is a fair dinkum turnaround after 10 years of going backwards. Between the 2020 census and mid-2024, a whopping 65% of country areas actually had more people moving in than out. While the numbers aren't huge just yet, the tide's definitely turned, eh? So what's the go with actually making this happen, according to history? Well, the Gervais mob in Pasadena, California, that's Jules and his kids, Aeneas, Justin, and Jordan, they've been running an urban homestead since '85, all on a tiny tenth of an acre. That tenth of an acre is only 4,346 square feet, just a regular suburban block, mind you, and it's only 50 feet from a big freeway. But from that patch, they churn out roughly 6,000 to 7,000 pounds of Tucker annually, from more than 400 different plant types. They kept over 100 families stocked up every week, plus a few local eateries. And get this, their yearly sales of fresh produce topped 60 grand, all from that little tenth of an acre. The big takeaway from Cuba's organoponicos is pretty much the same yarn. You don't need a massive block of land, you just need to actually use it. Take the Vivero Alamar Cooperative, for instance. It's set up on what used to be a construction site. Over in El Zero, the rooftop garden is just 68 square meters. And get a load of this. The Bethnal Green Victory Garden was actually built in an old bomb crater. It's not about whether you've got the perfect patch of dirt. It's about whether you're actually using what's available. The University of Minnesota did a 5-year study on home garden productivity with 89 keen master gardener volunteers helping out. What they found was pretty grouse. Chucking in about 2 hours a week, from May right through to November, can get you roughly 200 pounds of veggies. After all the costs, that's over $400 a year for just 2 hours of work a week. The whole setup for saving seeds is already good to go. Back in '75, Kent and Diana Wheely kicked off the Seed Savers Exchange with just a few heirloom varieties, brought over from Bavaria by a relative who was on their last legs. These days, the exchange looks after more than 25,000 rare plant types and has dished out over 1 million seed samples to its members. These are the sorts of varieties that don't need any fancy patent license, and they just keep on reproducing themselves, no worries. The official yarn about food hides something the big corporate seed system can't get its mitts on. Because here's the real kicker. More than 56% of American cropping land is now sown with patented, engineered seed types. Farmers can't legally keep and replant those seeds. They have to fork out cash again every single year. It's not just a chemical reliance, it's a legal one too. The Haber-Bosch chemical reliance and the patented seed reliance team up to make sure our modern food system can't keep itself going without buying stuff from a handful of big companies, season after season. Heirloom seeds are the real deal for financial freedom, something no central bank can get their grubby hands on. They just keep on reproducing. There's no other party involved. They don't show up on any balance sheet, and you can't devalue them, nick them, freeze them, or inflate them. Community-supported agriculture, or CSA, deserves a special shout-out because it offers something a backyard veggie patch can't. a solid supply connection already sorted before any dramas kick off. As of 2020, there were 7,200 CSA farms doing their thing across the states. When the supply chains went belly up during COVID, CSA farms copped a 50% jump in members in just a few days. When the supermarket shelves were bare, the folks who'd already hooked up directly with a local grower were still getting their tucker. Everyone else was stuck in a queue, waiting. It's a dead ringer for the Russian dacha barter economy, that's for sure. When the official distribution system goes pear-shaped, the people who can get straight to the source of production are sweet. But those relying on the retail supply chain are left out in the cold. This isn't just a guess about what's coming. It's a well-documented pattern, every single time. So in this clip, for anyone thinking about making a bigger move, like getting some rural land, a proper homestead, the sort of setup the Dervies mob have, history consistently shows us something. You can get pretty good at growing your own tucker in just one season, with a bit of basic advice. Proper food security, the kind that really protects you when the supply chain properly goes bung, takes a good 3 to 5 years of sticking at it. Best to get cracking before the drama hits, not when you're in the thick of it. Righto, get cracking now. Not because everything's gonna go belly up, but because it's such a bloody good deal. Chuck in a couple of hours a week and a bit of coin for seeds and dirt, and you're building something solid. No worries about dodgy mates, inflation biting ya, global dramas, or your tucker getting stuck halfway around the world. That old Russian Nan, growing over half her family's tucker on a patch smaller than a seventh of a tennis court. She wasn't doing it because she reckoned the Soviet Union was on its last legs, eh? Nah, she just kept at it, mate. That solid habit, kept going through the good times, even when it seemed a bit pointless, and even when the neighbors had a bit of a chuckle. That's what history always backs when the official system goes pear-shaped. Since 2019, 3 states have even brought in laws to explicitly protect your right to grow your own tucker. Down in Florida, SB 82, which became law in June 2019, stops local councils from chucking a ban on veggie patches in people's backyards. Illinois then followed suit with similar legislation a couple of years later in 2021. And get this, in November 2021, Maine voters gave the thumbs up to a constitutional right to food by a whopping 60%. First time that's happened in American history. So it's heaps easier to get started now than it has been for yonks. Detroit's got over 2,200 urban gardens and farms on land the city had pretty much chucked out as useless, getting nearly 20,000 locals involved. Every big city food drama over the last century has seen something similar. Havana's organoponicos, Moscow's dacha plots, London's allotments, all built on land the official economy didn't give a stuff about. The dirt's there, the seeds are there, and the know-how's still floating around, just on the fringes of the culture that binned it a generation back when things were good. The real question is, who's going to get cracking on it before it's bloody obvious? And who's going to wait until the queue at the corner shop is 2 blocks long and not moving an inch? Old Carlos, the bean counter over in Havana, eventually snagged himself a patch in the Vedado neighborhood, all done up from rubble. He grew tomatoes, sweet potatoes, and beans, fair dinkum. He picked up tips from his neighbors, who'd kept the old know-how alive from before the revolution, from the mob who'd grown their own tucker before Cuba turned into a big industrial farm. He flogged his extra produce at the fresh farmers market that had just opened up. By 2006, he was just one of 44,000 blokes and Sheilas doing the same thing all over Havana. Not special people, not preppers or survivalists or ideologues. Just your average accountants, teachers, and retired workers who, in their middle age, picked up a skill their grandparents would have just called normal. Every financial drama in the history books, right? What's left standing when the official system goes belly up? Gold's still there, silver's still there, skills are still there, community's still there, and the garden, mate, the garden's still there. It was around before money, before banks, before every single financial gizmo anyone ever dreamt up. No government in history has ever managed to inflate a tomato, eh? No central bank has ever debased a seed. And no exchange control has ever stopped a patch of dirt from churning out tucker for the family looking after it. History doesn't remember it as some fancy financial strategy. History remembers it as survival, which, when you get right down to it, is what financial strategy has always been about. Chuck us a sub so you don't miss out on the next video, mate.